Okay, good morning. Welcome back to our study on the divided kingdom. We are in lesson 3 today. This is Jeroboam and the golden calf. So last week we really got started in the text. The first week we did an introduction. We talked about this whole sweep of narrative all the way from Deuteronomy, which forms the hinge from the Torah to this narrative, through Joshua and Judges, and all the way through Samuel and Kings, and how this is sort of a connected piece with similar themes that take us through the history of the nation of Israel. And we got to Rehoboam, who is the son of
Solomon.
Thank you. Yeah, Solomon. So he is supposed to take over from Solomon. This is like the dynastic system of kings, right? The monarchy is going to travel from father to son. He's supposed to take over. But what did the people want from Rehoboam before he took over?
They want them to not, him to not tax them and work them as hard as Solomon did.
Yeah, ease up, right? Lighten the load of taxation and forced labor. They had been oppressed and by their own monarchy for the sake of the power and prestige of their country, and their country had expanded in its power and its wealth and prestige. And so, Rehoboam doesn't want to give up that opportunity. He wants to follow in those footsteps. And so he does not answer them favorably. And we saw some of our themes really coming through in the way that this played out. What did you learn, or what stuck with you about how these events worked out?
Well, even though there was instruction on exactly how to do things, he did not do them that way.
In fact, go ahead. It was like a checklist of things not to do, and he did them all, right? Or things to do, and he didn't do them, right? And we get that because we are looking back, right? This is the prophetic view that we're getting in hindsight. And so, in his reign and time, he's like, great, doing more, right? But that idea of checking ourselves against scripture, really looking at the ideas of what we're supposed to be. What is a king supposed to be? What is a servant of God supposed to be? And checking our behavior against that. Solomon didn't, and it was disastrous, wasn't it? What else? What did we see about wisdom? What happened with wisdom? We know Solomon was famed for his wisdom that was a gift from God.
Well, that obviously he didn't keep that up because he didn't follow God's commandments.
Yeah, and Rehoboam, how was Rehoboam in the wisdom department?
Not good. He didn't follow it either.
And we saw that loss of wisdom and Rehoboam following the power play rather than the search, the seeking out of wisdom. And we saw that God really did care about abuse and oppression, even if his people, he appointed Solomon, even if his people were the one that were doing it. And then, we wrestled a little bit with but this action was from the Lord, right? God allows our bad choices. He gives us choices, and then he actually lets us choose wrong. Sometimes when, we might be giving someone a choice, as soon as they choose wrong, we're like, but no, that was right, and God does give guidance and chances, and yet he allowed those bad choices and used everything for his purposes. And so the kingdom split. God is giving the grace of a remaining tribe, or two tribes to David's line through Rehoboam, while also starting this new opportunity in Israel. Okay, we met Jeroboam. We saw 2 weeks ago how he was anointed by God. We saw last week how he came back from Egypt to take over. And he has an opportunity, right? The thing that Ahijah promised, the prophet that did the ripping of the cloaks, y'all remember that story? Okay, the thing that Ahijah promised was to have a dynasty, or literally a house, as enduring as David's, by obeying God and by walking in his way. So if we are reading into this passage that we're starting today for the first time, we might go in with really high hopes for Jeroboam's reign, right? God has said, follow in my ways, and I will give you a house as enduring as David's. So let's start in 1 Kings 12, and someone read for us 25 through 33.
Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Peniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel and the other. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Jeroboam built shrines on the high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel, he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so verse 25. What is the first thing that Jeroboam does?
He fortified Shechem.
Right, okay. So he's going to make Shechem his capital. We talked about how Shechem had historical religious significance to the Israelites, and that may have been why they assembled there and brought Rehoboam in to ask their question. And so Jeroboam's just going to take advantage of that situation and make Shechem his capital, and he fortifies it. What's the point of fortifying a city? Why do you fortify a city?
Keep it from, yeah, to protect it.
Okay, to protect it, to keep it from protect against siege. Who's going to bring the siege?
Rehoboam.
Rehoboam.
Yeah, like the most immediate threat is his countrymen, right? So even though the last thing that we heard was God said not to bring a civil war, Rehoboam doesn't trust it. He's fortifying Shechem. Then he goes out and he fortifies another city. What's that city?
Peniel.
Okay, this is a city that is across the Jordan, and it would be a protective location against some of these surrounding nations. So the nations over there, Edom is way to the south, and then Moab, but above that is Ammon, and above that is Aram, or Damascus is the capital of Aram. And so we've got a little foreshadowing here because we're going to see a lot of problems with that nation coming up. And so fortifying Peniel would be in preparation for that. So who is he? But, moving on to verse 26 and following, who is Jeroboam most worried about? He's worried about Rehoboam, he's worried about Damascus, but then what's he really most concerned about?
The people going back to Rehoboam.
Yeah, his own people, right? Look at verse 27. He says that he would give their allegiance to, how does he say this?
Their Lord Rehoboam, king of Judah.
Right. So he, you get from this sort of thought attributed to Jeroboam that he thinks Rehoboam is their legitimate Lord. Is Jeroboam a legitimate king?
No, he's the son of Solomon.
So Rehoboam is the son of Solomon.
Yeah, I
Jeroboam,
thought-
remember, was an Ephraimite and a servant, right? So is he a legitimate king? Well,
Not in
so
line.
from a dynastic standpoint, from the line, he is not a legitimate king. What gives Jeroboam his legitimacy?
The Lord had given it to him.
Right. His legitimacy is completely just a gift from the Lord, right? So who does he really not trust?
Rehoboam. The Lord. Yeah, the Lord.
The Lord, yeah. I mean, I think both, right all around. The idea that he thinks he can't hold the people, even though God has given them to him as a gift, is he just doesn't trust God to do it for him, does he? And we're going to see that come out over and over, right? He doesn't trust God who has made him king. And what does he think will happen?
That the people, if they go to Jerusalem, will follow their Lord Rehoboam.
Okay, and why would they go to
kill
Jerusalem?
him, yeah.
What, Deanna? I didn't hear that.
Why would they go to Jerusalem? What's going to cause them to go to Jerusalem?
That's where the temple is.
To pray.
Yeah, and what did you say, Dia?
To pray. That means to the temple.
Yeah, to worship, to go to the temple to worship. And remember, they have these important festivals, and the Jews would go to Jerusalem, go to the temple for these important festivals, right? And so he says, he specifically says, if they go, your NIV will say temple, but this is literally house. We've talked about the theme that surrounds this word house, right? Verse 27, if these people go to offer sacrifices at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will give their allegiance, right? So this is, he's worried about the worship of the Lord. What should Jeroboam's attitude be toward the worship of the Lord?
Well, they go up to the temple to offer up sacrifices.
Yeah. And what was the most?
Oh, go ahead.
No, you please.
Oh, I was just going to say it's something that they're supposed to be doing.
Right? He should want the people to go to offer the sacrifices. Also, what is the most important job of the king?
To guide his people to do the right thing.
Yeah, when we read that passage in Deuteronomy, we saw that he is supposed to be meditating on the law and worshiping, and that worship is actually his job, and leadership in following God is the most important aspect of his legitimacy and success. He's got it completely flipped, right? He views worship as an aspect of political control. Right? He's going to take what should be approaching God, who has put him in the place of king, and make it how he's going to manipulate the people who he doesn't believe belong in staying with him because he doesn't trust God. Right? So it's all about, like, how is religion going to work against me from a very human standpoint? How can I use it to benefit me from this very human standpoint, right? What's the other aspect influencing Jeroboam's thinking in the beginning of verse 28?
Got advice from other people, not from God.
Right, the same kind of theme of counsel or bad counsel. Rehoboam had his bad counsel. So this idea of loss of wisdom is that just as Rehoboam got bad counsel, Jeroboam seeks out what must have been bad advice. Okay, so what does he do instead of allowing the people to go to Jerusalem as they were commanded to do?
He builds the idols there for them to stay in their own city.
Yeah, yeah. Where does he put his little worship centers?
In the north and the south.
Yes, conveniently located, one on each end of the country, right? Bethel is in the far south, and Dan is in the far north. And Bethel has, we talked about Shechem having a spiritual and religious significance. Bethel definitely does as well. Bethel means house of God, right? We talked about that word, the prefix or, combination word with bet in it is always house. So Bethlehem is house of bread. Bethel is house of God. It's where Jacob had the dream of the ladder and the angels ascending and descending from heaven. And God promised there to give him the land to his descendants, and kind of a renewal and a repetition of the promise to Abraham. It's a holy site. And Jeroboam takes advantage of it for his purposes. What does he make and put there?
A golden calf.
Right? A golden calf. What? What does that remind us of?
Moses,
Moses.
when he goes up
Moses?
to get the 10 Commandments and he comes down and finds the people have made a golden calf.
Right, right. Remember, the people say to themselves, so this is we talked about the parallels last week, right? Where Solomon had become like Pharaoh and now Rehoboam is like Pharaoh. And we saw the sort of tentative casting of Jeroboam in the role of Moses. Like, is he in the role of Moses or is he not, right? Like, maybe he was a reluctant leader, or maybe he's been inciting insurrection all along. We talked about like, how does he fit? Does he fit with Moses? Well, here we do not see him fitting with Moses, right? Because when Moses was on Mount Sinai, like, he's with God getting the 10 Commandments, but he was gone so long that the people said to Aaron, we don't know what's happened to that fellow. Like, they gave up on God's timing, didn't they? And they said to Aaron, make us this golden calf. And so Aaron did it, right? He says, well, give me your jewelry. And he forges this golden calf. Later, when he tells Moses about it, it's like, and out popped this calf. Like, who knew? But he forges this calf. And what does he say to the people as he presents them their calf?
It's too hard for you to go to Jerusalem.
Okay, yes, Jeroboam is saying that, but then, and then he follows it up with what statement?
Here are
Here
your
are
gods.
your gods.
Okay, where is the echo from the Sinai story there? The calf, but also this statement, right? When we go back and read this in Exodus 32, we see that Aaron presents the calf to the people and says, here is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt, right? Jeroboam does the same thing. The words are the same. He repeats it. Like, there's no chance that this is a coincidence that we get an echo of this story here. Okay, why? What's going on with this? Well, let's finish and see what all else Jeroboam does. And then we're going to talk about what is going on with this golden calf. Couldn't he know better? Okay, what else does Jeroboam do?
He builds shrines and appoints priests who are not Levites.
Okay, so here's another point where our translation is not doing us any favor. Verse 31, Jeroboam built literally houses on the high places. So there is a direct competition between, he says, that if they go to the house of the Lord, they'll leave me. I will build houses on the high places, right? Remember the Davidic covenant, right? Is the offer to David was to have a house. And the offer to Jeroboam was a house as good as David, but Jeroboam doesn't trust the house of the Lord, right? It's if you go to the house of the Lord, so I will build these houses on the high places, rival houses, and he appoints priests who are not Levites. And then what does he institute?
Make a
A
festival.
Festival.
Yeah, right, because the festivals are like the big draw for the temple in Jerusalem. Like they would go there every year, right? So he institutes a festival, and the text is quite clear that it's like the festival in Judah, right? It's supposed to be a competitive event, and he chooses a day. The Feast of Tabernacles is on the 15th day of the 7th month. So Jeroboam picks the 15th day of the 8th month. So that's why it says a month of his own choosing, right? Like he just like moves, he just shifts it a day. He's like, hey, here's your festival. So and Aaron also, as soon as he presented the calf, here is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt, and tomorrow will be a festival day to the Lord, right? Like this is the unauthorized festival is a part of the pattern, right? Okay. How did it go? You know, we have to say, like, okay, how did it go for the Israelites with the golden calf? Did that turn out well for them? What happened?
Well, they ended up having to drink the gold.
Yeah, I mean, Moses came down, he was angry, he breaks the tablets, there's these negative consequences, and the Israelites died, and you know, there was a scene of violence and retribution because of this action. So this golden calf, like we put it in the category of a bad thing. Why does Jeroboam then repeat it?
Did he not have the history?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, right? We have this looking back version, this minority report that gives the perspective of the prophetic view. And maybe he didn't have the prophetic view. He certainly wasn't someone who was in, you know, whose heart was attuned to the Lord and the Lord's perspective, right? What
And
else?
there were some festival I recall a festival where they were to have read this story in the temple. So it was there if they had continued doing that, but of course Solomon probably didn't have them do that. But
Yeah.
it was available and it was part of what God had decreed. Don't forget, read this every year.
Don't forget. Yeah. And I think you're right on with that, is that they were to remember, and yet we see that they did not remember. And so this idea of a calf is a very common idea in pagan nations and pagan worship. And so he draws on what's available to him. Now, you might say, well, and some scholars have said that the calf, and I think there's some truth to this, because here is your God, O Israel, that brought you up out of Egypt. I think the calf is supposed to just facilitate the worship of the Lord. They're taking it and making it their own. Well, are they allowed to do that? You know, that's not what God wanted. He said, no graven images, right? And so, you know, I think he had a symbol. It was a symbol from the nations. It was a symbol from their history, even if it was a bad one. You know, sometimes we get a sort of associations that we don't remember. If you're not paying attention, you may not remember what is good and what is bad. This reminded me of when James and I were first together, or maybe first married. I told him that I really don't like stargazer lilies. They are, you know, I know they're big and they're showy and they're pretty, but the fragrance is just terrible. It gives me a terrible headache. It's overpowering. Bad. Stargazer lilies, bad. Well, James is very considerate to bring me flowers, and the next multiple times, like, I mean, this, I'm not talking about weekly, I'm talking about, like, you know, on Valentine's Day and our anniversary. The next multiple times he brought me flowers, what do you think he brought?
Stargazers.
Over and over and over. Now, was he trying to be offensive, as I eventually accused him of being? It's just, you just have a vague memory. Flowers? Stargazer. I remember something about stargazer lilies. I think it's a sense of inattention. And to be fair, this is not the most important thing in the world, right? For a person to remember. And so I think like out of the history of Israel comes like, golden calf, and so very, very bad idea. And yet we see that the heart that is not turned towards God just sees us on some random thing, not random at all, from the history, from the surrounding nations, and he's going to use it for his own purposes, right? So we as readers, right, we've talked about how the themes run through the whole story, right? We as readers know very bad idea. And so we're supposed to be thinking, what is the consequence going to be? Let's read chapter 13, verses 1 through 10.
By the word of the Lord, a man of God came from Judah to Bethel as Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make an offering. By the word of the Lord, he cried out against the altar, "Altar, altar." This is what the Lord says. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you, he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you. That same day, the man of God gave a sign. This is the sign the Lord has declared. The altar will be split apart, and the ashes on it will be poured out. When King Jeroboam heard what the man of God cried out against the altar at Bethel, he stretched out his hand from the altar and said, "Seize him." But the hand he stretched out toward the man shriveled up so that he could not pull it back. Also, the altar was split apart and its ashes poured out according to the sign given by the man of God by the word of the Lord. Then the king said to the man of God, "Intercede with the Lord your God and pray for me that my hand may be restored." So the man of God interceded with the Lord, and the king's hand was restored and became as it was before. The king said to the man of God, "Come home with me for a meal, and I will give you a gift." But the man of God answered the king, "Even if you were to give me half your possessions, I would not go with you, nor would I eat bread or drink water here. For I was commanded by the word of the Lord, you must not eat bread or drink water or return by the way you came." So he took another road and did not return by the way he had come to Bethel.
Thank you. Okay, so Jeroboam finally feeling like a real king, right? Anybody who had lived through the reign of Solomon would remember the dedication of the temple and the huge spectacle and like this amazing and moving moment when the Ark of the Covenant is brought in and the presence of the Lord descends on the temple, and Solomon makes these prayers of dedication, and there's feasting for days and days. And so all of that is like the image of the real king, right? And so Jeroboam is going to go, he's going to go to the altar. He's going to have a moment. He's going to have a dedication. He feels like a new king. And what happens?
Well, the altar splits and all the ashes are dumped.
Yeah. So he's interrupted by this man of God. Where's the man of God come from?
Dia?
What did you say, Dia?
Well, it says by a man of God came from Judea to Bethlehem.
Yeah, so from Judah or Judea, we get this journey. So he's coming from the legitimate place, right? So he's kind of an outsider to the reign of Jeroboam, right? He comes from Judah. He gives this prophecy, and he says that the altar is going to have, this is kind of terrible. What is the prophecy?
Sounds like they're sacrificing a person.
It does sound that way. That it sounds like they're going to kill the priests and burn them on the altar. Now, this does eventually bear out to be true. Now, so if we're a first reader of this story, we don't know if this is a short-term event or a long-term. But if we have read the entire story, we know that this is many generations later that we get to Josiah, this king that is named Josiah, right? And he doesn't actually like kill people in order to burn their bones on the altar. He just digs up some bones and burns them on the altar. And we'll talk about, when we get to that part of the story, we'll talk about why he does that. It's the idea of disallowing the altar from further use, is what's going on with that. So that does eventually happen, but it's the long term, right? So what happens in the short term? How does Jeroboam respond, and what's the sign? Verse 4.
Well, the
So he
altar does
puts his
split
arm
and
out,
the ashes come out.
Yeah, and what else?
and he puts his arm out and it shrivels.
Yeah, so Jeroboam reaches out his hand with a seize him, right? And that seize him, his hand shrivels up so that he cannot draw it back, and the altar split. So there is this scene of power. What are these meant to prove?
That God's in charge. God is in
Yeah,
charge.
that the long-term part will come true, that God is in charge, right? This is meant to be a wake-up call, right? What happens with the shriveled hand?
It
Verse
gets it
6.
shriveled.
Fixes it. He
Yeah.
asked for it to be fixed back.
Does
Pray
that
for
surprise
him.
you?
Yeah.
It does me too. Jeroboam did this really, really, really stupid thing, and he's persisting in it. And why would his hand get fixed?
To show the power of God.
The power of God, and I think the grace of God, right? The grace of the second chance, right? He's given, he asks, intercede with your God. We see there's a hierarchy here, right? Jeroboam, God is Jeroboam's God too, but he recognizes that he is far from God. And here is this prophet speaking the word of the Lord, and it's intercede with your God for me, and his hand is restored. And then what does he want the prophet to do? Jeroboam want the prophet to do?
Go home with him so he can reward him.
Yeah, what does that make you think? What is that kind of smack of? Go ahead, Dia.
He's all,
Oh, he might kill him.
What's that?
Might have him killed. He might not let him go back to Judah.
Oh, okay. That's one. I don't know. Maybe. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, he might think, okay, the power is coming from this prophet and not from God. And if I reward him, maybe there'll be better things.
Right. So maybe he is going to sort of get some influence here. Notice he's going to give him a gift. Let me feed you. Let me give you a gift. Maybe he's going to try to get whatever this power is on his own side.
Maybe a little bribe.
Maybe so. And it sort of, it really reinforces Jeroboam's idea of how things work and how he totally misunderstands the power of God, right? We're going to get more of that in the story of Jeroboam's wife too. So he tries to get the prophet to stay with him, but what does the prophet say?
No, I told him not to do that.
Yeah, why not? What's he supposed to do instead?
Go forward.
Go straight to go home a different way and don't stop to eat or drink anything.
Right. He's supposed to go straight back. He's not supposed to return the way he came. He's supposed to take a different route, presumably so that no one can stop him and prevent him from finishing his mission, right? He's supposed to make this journey. We're not sure exactly where in Judah he came from, but if it were from Jerusalem, this would be a 21-mile round trip. And he's supposed to be doing this without eating or drinking. So he is supposed to be getting it done. He's not supposed to be dawdling. All right, let's look. Just look at the incident in 11 through 34. We have a strange incident here. So He's supposed to be going back, but there is this old prophet, and the old prophet hears about what happens and says, well, which way did he go? And his sons tell him, he saddles up the donkey and goes after him. Verse 14, prophet, not dawdling, supposed to be headed straight back, not even allowed to stop for a drink. What do we find him doing in verse 14?
Sitting under an oak tree.
Yeah, what's he doing? Why
He's
is he
resting.
Why is it? What? He's not even allowed to drink water. We have our first hint that he is not exactly following the scheme that God has laid out for him. And so, what does the man of God do, or the old prophet? What does the old prophet do?
He lies to him.
Right? He lies to him and lures him to return the way he came, right? There's a little key on that word return. It shows up multiple times, not always. The NIV doesn't translate everyone, as we often see with the NIV, but he returns with the old prophet back the way he came, and he eats bread and he drinks water, which he was not supposed to do. And while they're at the meal, the old prophet, who, so far has lied, right? He gets a word from the Lord. And what is the word from the Lord?
Defied what the Lord told you to do. You didn't keep his commandment.
Yeah, it's a judgment for his disobedience, which we feel not too great about, considering the old prophet was maybe complicit in that, right? But as the young prophet leads, this lion kills him. And what are we told about the lion?
It just waits there with him.
Right. What is that supposed to indicate?
God.
God is keeping him from eating him.
Yeah.
Right. This is not a natural event. This is not random occurrence, but it's a consequence from the Lord. So we see by the lion's unusual behavior that we have something sent from the Lord. It's a really weird story because we want to know, like, why would the prophet lie to him? Why would he do that? Okay. I don't think there's anything in here that provides us a motive for this old prophet until we get to the very end of this story. But let's look at it from a literary or thematic standpoint. What is this story telling us?
Well, God didn't give him a second chance.
Yeah, or maybe sitting under the oak tree was the first chance, and I don't know. Yeah, no. So there is this consequence that was not avoidable, was it? What else? What is this telling us? Like, if you think, like, why is this story in there?
When God tells you to do something, you need to do it.
Yeah. Everyone has to obey God. No one is exempt. Even prophets who speak in power, who can split off altars and restore shriveled hands, even those people have to follow the commands of God. And if prophets aren't exempt, are kings exempt?
Mhm.
And in New Testament terms, we're supposed to test what we hear against the word of God.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point that he should have. I think although it's easy to blame the old prophet for lying to him, he had his instructions directly from the Lord. And someone saying, no, the Lord didn't mean it. Sounds a lot like the snake in the garden, doesn't it? We have to really be on our guard for what is really the truth of the Lord, right? And God is going to follow through, and the reader should expect it, right? As we're reading this, the covenant consequences, the reader is the reader of the time of the exile, right? Or post-exile, right? Covenant consequences are not a shocker. They are to be expected from disobedience, right? So we
And
get the
the consequence to the young prophet was quite severe. Jeroboam got a second chance. His hand was shriveled and it was repaired.
And he built idols, yeah.
But the prophet, all he did, he stopped and rested. And he had a very severe consequence
Yeah.
for
And he
disobeying
was
the word of the
lured
Lord.
into, but he did directly disobey the instructions of God in the service of speaking the word of the Lord. And so I think, when we are the person who's given the responsibility of speaking the word of the Lord, this is us, right? This is the Great Commission. We all have this responsibility. We have to take it seriously and expect that God will follow through. We see at the very end when the prophet is buried, he doesn't get to go, the man of God, he doesn't get to go be buried in the tomb of his ancestors. Instead, he's buried there. And the old prophet says, when I die, bury my bones with the bones of the man of God. That will show up in the follow-on story that's all the way down in Second Kings 23. So we will talk about that when we get there. But the idea that this old prophet wanted his bones to be buried with the man of God may indicate that his whole motivation was just to get on the outskirts of what God is doing. Whereas, I think over and over, God invites people to really be involved in what he is doing. So we see that Jeroboam does not repent, and we move into the next story. Someone read for us 14:1-9.
At that time, Ahijah, son of Jeroboam, became ill, and Jeroboam said to his wife, go disguise yourself so you won't be recognized as the wife of Jeroboam. Then go to Shiloh. Ahijah the prophet is there, the one who told me I would be king over this people. Take 10 loaves of bread with you, some cakes, and a jar of honey, and go to him. He will tell you what will happen to the boy. So Jeroboam's wife did what he said and went to Ahijah's house in Shiloh. Now Ahijah could not see. His sight was gone because of his age. But the Lord had told Ahijah, Jeroboam's wife is coming to ask you about her son, for he is ill, and you are to give her such and such an answer. When she arrives, she will pretend to be someone else. So when Ahijah heard the sound of her footsteps at the door, he said, come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why this pretense? I have been sent to you with bad news. Go tell Jeroboam that this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I raised you up from among the people and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David, who kept my commands and followed me with his heart, doing only what was right in my eyes. You have done more evil than all who have lived before you. You have made for yourself other gods, idols made of metal. You have aroused my anger and turned your back on me.
Thank you. So what does Jeroboam tell his wife to do?
Pretend to be somebody else.
Yeah, pretend to put on a disguise, pretend to be somebody else, right? They're trying to hide their identity from a prophet of the Lord, right? This is like Saul disguising himself to go try to bring up the spirit of Samuel and consult. There's this idea that they think that they can go against God and that this disguise is going to enable them to still use the power of God for their own purposes, right? Does he even need would she have even needed a visual disguise? What do we learn about Ahijah the prophet?
He's blind.
He's blind, right? This is funny. This is this the strangeness here of physically disguising yourself from a blind person, and yet even the blind sees more than Jeroboam and company do, right? Who is really blind? The blind is the one who thinks that they can manipulate God. right? So how does God, through the prophet, describe Jeroboam's behavior?
He's done everything wrong.
Right? He says, I raised you up. I made you a leader. I tore the kingdom. We're back to that, the prophet with the robe and the tearing of the pieces, right? This was the same prophet. This was Ahijah, the very one who tore those pieces and anointed Jeroboam. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David, right, and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David. You have done more evil than all those who lived before you, making these idols, right? And as we continue on, God gives his verdict, right? I'm going to bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam. I'll cut off every last male. I'll burn it up, and dogs will eat those who belong to Jeroboam in the city, and the birds will feed on those who die in the country. Okay. This is like, it may seem a little on the gruesome side. I think it's meant to be on the gruesome side, but it's also meant to say your legacy, right? There's not even a grave to visit, right? You don't get the mausoleum with the respect and the line and the legacy, right? God had offered to give you a legacy, a dynasty, a house, but you have turned down that offer, and there will be no legacy. Everything of your house will be destroyed. There won't be even a grave to visit. And when you go back home, the boy will die, and he's the best off of all of you, right? He gets the favor of dying and being buried because he's the only one who has in whom the God of Israel has found anything good, verse 13. And so he's going to die. And what's God going to do, verse 14?
Raise up a king.
Yeah, try again, right? A king that will destroy the family of Jeroboam, and a new king. He's going to continue to try to bring a king who will be faithful. And yet we see there is an impact on the whole house of Israel, right? The Lord, verse 15, the Lord will strike Israel so that it will be like a reed swaying in the water. The stability will be impacted because of Jeroboam's behavior, right? His actions will have consequence on the whole nation, so that it will be uprooted from the good land that he gave to their forefathers and scattered beyond the river, because they provoked the Lord by making Asherah poles. This was another form of idolatry, one that included a lot of sexual sin in the worship, and he will give Israel up because of the sins Jeroboam has committed and has caused Israel to commit. And here we have the first saying in verse 16 of a refrain that will show up over and over on the house of Israel. The sins of Jeroboam that he committed and caused Israel to commit is a theme that is going to run through these other kings in the house of Israel. So she goes home, the boy dies, they bury for him, and we're left knowing that because the first part the short-term part became true, that the long-term part will also come true. And then we get this closing little piece, the other events of Jeroboam's reigns, his wars, and how he ruled. Are they not written in the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? He reigned for 22 years and rested with his father, and Nadab, his son, succeeded him as king. So we talked about how there are these sources that give the king's side, but we have the prophetic side here. Okay, questions or comments on this section?
Don't you find it interesting that way back when there was no king and the people begged God for a king, and this is what they're getting?
Yeah, and that was the warning, right? Monarchy has always been a double-edged sword, and we get kind of the theme of both the benefits and the dangers of monarchy running all the way through this narrative, right? That when God gives you a king, he's supposed to follow God, and you're going to follow him as he follows God. And yet we also get these warnings that, like, if you get a king, he's going to take your sons and daughters for forced labor. He's going to tax you. And then we get these stories of the kings leading them into sin when they were supposed to be leading them into the worship of God, right? Yeah, absolutely. Great point. What else? What else strikes you?
Well, I have a problem with the two men of God, or the old man
Uh-huh.
who lied to the younger prophet. And I don't understand why nothing happened to him. He was the one that lied. And I mean, I would think if he's a man of God and he tells you that God told him something different, that why wouldn't he think, well, I guess God's, changed his mind, or, I don't know. Just
Yeah, I think it's a disturbing story. It's a strange story. It's one that leaves us with questions. That's all quite legitimate. I understand. I don't know that I have a lot of answers. I think we can make some sense of it by looking at like the literary effect of it, like the kind of thematic effect of it in the text. And yet just thinking of it from a human standpoint, like, he's a prophet. Why would he lie? Why? What did he want? Did he just want to be buried, his bones buried with a young, and was there any we don't know. Maybe there was a consequence, but we don't get any in the text.
maybe he was. I mean, but I don't understand why. It just seems weird.
It does seem weird. It's not just weird, it's a little upsetting, I think. We don't like to see someone lured into wrong action.
Yeah.
And yet, and like when Satan says, well, did God really say that? Actually, this, we know that we're talking about a source of evil in the world. And yet this old prophet does not exactly seem like a source of evil in the world, right? Like, what is he doing? Is he really evil? And checking our actions against the true word of the Lord is kind of where I land with it. I don't know. What do y'all think? What are your thoughts?
I think we can't understand everything that we read.
I know. Why did they put more in? we need details.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, why does God pick Jeroboam? Doesn't he know that he's not going to be faithful?
Yeah, excellent point, right? He gives him this opportunity, and yet we have no hint whatsoever that he seems to have planned to be faithful or tried to be faithful, right? At least with Solomon, we think he tried a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah,
And
this
22 years. Gracious, that's a long time.
yeah. He's given this prophetic prediction of like the destruction of his house, but he reigns for 22 years and his son succeeds him as king. And so we're left waiting for that other shoe to drop, right? Mm-hmm. We know that there is not a consequence yet, and yet we're expecting a consequence. Well, I mean, the son died, and that's terrible, right? If you think about it from like the person, the people involved, that's terrible. And yet we know that there's more to come, and so it leaves us there. And we have quite a progression. Like, notice the progression, right? Turn back to verse 33 and 34 of chapter 13, right? What does 33 say?
He changes ways.
He did not change his ways even after this. Mm-hmm. So these events with the prophet who came and the splitting of the altar and the shriveled hand and the restored hand, like all of this, what was that meant to do?
change him or to wake him up and let him turn his life around,
Right, this was the warning, this was the opportunity, this was the first stage. Notice what when the prophet first comes, 13:02, what is the prophecy against? Is it against Jeroboam?
against the altar.
Fight against the altar.
Yeah, like it's almost like the altar is like the representative of Jeroboam's sin. It's not even a prophecy against Jeroboam himself yet. After this elaborate disobedience, we get this initial stage is really just against the altar. And we say, it seems like very harsh judgment from God when we get through the story of Ahijah and his prophetic word about the dogs and the birds. And yet we see the patience of God here, right? He begins with just this prophecy against the altar and with this healing of Jeroboam and these opportunities to repent, the patient in the 22 years of reign. If Jeroboam had repented in any of that time, I think God would have relented because he does it in other circumstances. It's like where Jonah says, like, I knew you would relent. That's why I didn't want to preach to Nineveh, right? So the patience of God and the opportunities to repent are there over and over. And I think we need to look at this story and ask ourselves, how might I be turning religion into something that serves me or serves a good cause instead of seeking God in relationship and being part of his plan, right? God gave all these opportunities to repent, but in the end, he is serious about our obedience, and he is going to bring about the plans that he has for all of creation, for the world, for his purposes. He makes offers, he gives us chances, but we don't get to subvert it for our own purposes. The story of Jeroboam speaks to me in that God, even as Lord of time and history, he invited Jeroboam to participate, and he invited Jeroboam to be blessed in that participation. Jeroboam didn't participate properly. He tried to take the work of God and use it for his own ends. That doesn't work. But we have an opportunity to participate in what God is doing on God's terms in the loving submission that enables us to use him. We can be a part of what he does in his work and in his purposes. Other thoughts? Well, thank you for the good discussion today. Next week, we are on lesson 4, and I've titled this, I struggled with the title. I've called it Both Kingdoms Decline. So we'll be going back and forth between the North and the South. We'll be seeing what happens with Rehoboam and with Jeroboam's son, and seeing how they fare, in this generations immediately after the division. The reading we'll start in 1421, where we left off today, and go through 1628. Thank you, everyone.
Deanna.
Yes,
Thank
go ahead.
you. Are there any announcements? And Sharon McMichael has our prayer today, our closing